So today I'm going to describe some of the opportunities and risks involved in buying property in Japan. I'm going to tell you about some of the things that make Japan unique and share some investment strategies, and I'm going to wrap up with a case study at the end. But first, a little bit of background. As Martin mentioned, I own residential property in Tokyo. I lived there from 1989 to 1992. I only speak a smattering of Japanese. I'm not fluent. And I travel to Japan 2 or 3 times a year. I am, by nature, I'm a value investor, and I tend to invest conservatively. And my investments are an outgrowth of the research that I've done for the books that I've written. So let's start with some of the challenges. Unlike a place like, say, England, for example, Japan's real estate market is not really foreigner friendly. Non-Japanese retail investors are relatively thin on the ground, and English-speaking agents are also fairly rare. All of the documentations that you're going to deal with, the sale and purchase agreement, deeds, rental contracts, and so on, are all in Japanese. You might be able to get a translation from your agent or for some of the supporting people, but that translation is only for reference. It's not legally enforceable. So clearly, the more Japanese you understand and the more you understand how the system works, the further ahead you're going to be. Second, Japan's financial services industry is heavily regulated, and it's not really noted for being innovative. If you're Japanese, there's lots of lenders that you can choose from, and it's relatively easy and relatively inexpensive to get a mortgage. However, it gets progressively harder if you are a foreigner who's a permanent resident of Japan, if you're a foreigner who's not a resident, or for that matter, if you're a foreigner who doesn't live in Japan. And as a result of that, many non-residents end up paying cash because it's difficult to get financing. So at present, Tokyo branches of banks from Taiwan, Australia, and mainland China are lending in Japan to non-resident foreigners. But this is very much a niche market, and some of the banks require, for example, that you're able to speak Chinese or Japanese. Also, the maximum loan to valuation ratio tends to be low, and also the minimum amounts tend to be high because it costs them the same amount to underwrite a small loan as it does a large one. So if you're looking at making a modest purchase, it's not really set up to do that. And also, these banks generally charge higher interest rates than the large Japanese banks do. Listings are another issue. This is a typical ad that you'd see in the window of a real estate agent in Japan. It's for an 18 square meter one-room apartment with a small kitchen and a small balcony. It's in Katsushika-ku, which is in the northeastern part of Tokyo. It's a working class sort of neighborhood, and it's about 15 minutes from the train station, from the nearest station. The price is 4 million yen, and that's about right given the size and the distance from the train station, and also the nature of what the neighborhood is like. If you're from Canada or the States and you're familiar with something called the multiple listing system, Japan has something similar to that called the Real Estate Investment Information Network System, or RAINS, but that's entirely in Japanese, and it's only available to registered agents. It's not available to the public like MLS is in North America. There are consumer-oriented websites that are run by people like Microsoft and Yahoo, and you can get at those using Google Translate. You can actually extract information from them. But they're not, again, not really that user-friendly. And from a buyer's perspective, the Japanese market and the listing process is actually quite opaque. There's nothing like Zillow or Redfin or anything like that that you might be familiar with from the States. Fourth, Japanese institutions have their own way of doing things. Unlike many places, for example, you can't open a bank account in Japan unless you're registered as a resident there. Also, your credit rating here in Hong Kong or in Singapore means very, very little to Japanese lenders. They really don't care. Your paperwork, when you apply for a loan, has got to be prepared exactly right. So, for example, Christopher Dillon is not at all the same as Christopher J. Dillon, and Chris Dillon is somebody else entirely. So you got to get it exactly right. When you buy a house in Japan, there's another peculiarity called the explanation of important matters. And what that is the Japanese agent has got to read the sale and purchase agreement to you and a whole bunch of other stuff out loud. That's the law. And that process for an uncomplicated sale can take 30 minutes. If it's a complicated deal, on the other hand, it can take 8 hours. So bring coffee. Finally, Japanese homes traditionally have had a lifespan of about 30 years, and that was based on a Japanese concept of one house for one generation. After one generation, the house was torn down and then rebuilt. And despite the fact that Japanese winters are cold and Japan imports virtually all of its energy, a lot of Japanese houses are really cold and drafty. This is changing as the Japanese government is encouraging the development of more environmentally friendly, more durable houses. But much of Japan's housing stock is still of that 30-year-old variety. So if you're thinking of buying a house to fix up in Japan, you really want to do your homework very carefully because not all houses lend themselves to that. So now let's look at some of the opportunities. Unlike China, you don't have to be a resident to actually buy in Japan. There's no hidden or extra taxes for foreigners like there is in Singapore or here in Hong Kong. And very importantly, you can buy freehold in Japan. And that's important because in Japan, the value is generally not in the building, it's in the land underneath it. Second, after years of economic stagnation, Japanese real estate is cheap. According to The Economist magazine, Japanese homes are undervalued by 37% compared to rents and to income. In the same scale, Hong Kong is overvalued by 84%. You can buy apartments like this one here for less than 10 million yen per door, or about 100,000 US dollars. Sometimes you can get them for as little as 5 million yen a door. And the net rental yields on these places typically is about 7%, although you can sometimes achieve as high as 10%. And typically these are small, older apartments inside Tokyo's 23 wards. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Speaking of money, if you've been following the Forex markets recently, you'll note that the yen is now over 100 to the US dollar, well off of its highs of 77 a couple of years ago, and that makes Japanese property relatively affordable. If you're investing in real estate in a high-growth market like Hong Kong or China or Singapore for that matter, Japanese property can be a very good addition to your portfolio because it doesn't move in tandem with those markets. If there was a major correction in Beijing or Shanghai tomorrow, it would have very little impact on prices in Tokyo. Japanese tenants are another attraction. In generally, they don't move very frequently, they're undemanding, they're responsible, and they're reliable. Japanese tenants also provide a guarantor as part of the rental deal, and that's typically a family member, an employer, or an outside company, and that guarantor guarantees that your rent will actually get paid at the end of the month. In many cities, working class neighborhood means abandoned cars like this one, graffiti, and street crime. But in Tokyo, even modest neighborhoods generally are clean, they're neat, and they're safe. But you might encounter some fairly unusual zoning. For example, this gas storage facility is in Narimaku, and that was actually shot off the balcony. That picture was shot off the balcony of a residential apartment block. There's 6 of those gas storage balls, and each one of them is 40 meters in size across. You probably wouldn't want to live next to one of those, but there are lots of neighborhoods in Tokyo that are very attractive, that have got really, really cool architecture, Michelin-starred restaurants, great music, and great art. And of course, Tokyo is going to get another boost in 2020 when the city hosts the Olympic Games. Those are some of the attractions. Let's look at now some of the risks. As the tragic events of March the 11th, 2011 clearly illustrate, Japan is vulnerable to earthquakes. The Japanese government currently believes that Tokyo is overdue for a major quake, and if one was to strike in the northern part of Tokyo Bay, the current estimates suggest that there would be 11,000 deaths, 850,000 buildings would collapse, and economic losses would total 112 trillion yen. That's scary. Fortunately, though, Japanese seismic engineering is among the best in the world, and you can also buy earthquake insurance as a rider for your home's fire insurance policy. Unlike some places, however, residential buildings in Japan don't have to be retrofitted to meet current seismic regulations. And the most recent update to the seismic regulations was made in 1981. So if you're going to buy as an investment, you probably want to buy a home that was built after 1982, because that's up in current with all of the code. Second, as the situation at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station demonstrates, there's an issue there. A cleanup of the size and scope of what's going on at Fukushima is unprecedented. It's never been attempted before. And there are legitimate concerns about TEPCO's ability to manage that cleanup process, which is going to take decades to complete. Fukushima is one of more than 50 nuclear installations in Japan, and that includes power stations, fuel reprocessing plants, and research and experimental facilities as well. As I point out in my book, Japan's nuclear industry has had several incidents, and some of those have been fatal, and several of the nuclear power facilities are actually located on or near earthquake fault lines. So if you buy a home in Japan, you're going to have to make your peace with Fukushima, with the nuclear industry, as well as with public concerns about that. Because it doesn't matter if you're comfortable with it, if you're going to try and sell it to somebody who isn't comfortable with it, you're going to have a hard time. Furthermore, Japan's nuclear plants are currently all offline, and imported natural gas is being used to make up the power shortage. Those imports are expensive, and they're also driving up Japan's carbon footprint. That brings me to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's program to revitalize Japan's economy through quantitative easing, infrastructure spending, and devaluation of the yen. There's anecdotal evidence that Abenomics is actually making people feel a bit more optimistic, and we've seen a small pop in property prices. But Abenomics is also contributing to Japan's growing national debt. And if you were following it, you probably noticed in August that that topped for the first time 1 quadrillion yen. So that's 1 followed by 15 zeros. That's a lot of money. Some economists see that as posing a major threat of hyperinflation and also of the yen collapse. Demographics are also a major challenge for Japan. Japanese women are not marrying as often as they used to, and when they do marry, they marry later and they're having fewer children. A growing number of Japanese people are also living alone. One-person households made up 20% of the total. Now in 2010, it's gone up to 32%, and by 2035, the National Institute of Population and Social Security Research expects that 37% of the population is going to be singletons living alone. Those households comprise people who never married, people who've been divorced, and also older people who've outlived their spouses. Despite Japan's shrinking population, though, the number of households is actually growing, and it's expected to peak at over 53 million in 2020. That's creating strong demand for those small single-person apartments. Another demographic trend that you have to keep an eye on is depopulation of Japan's rural areas. Farmers are retiring and they're dying off, and as a result, rural towns and villages are shrinking and in some cases disappearing entirely. That's complicated by the fact that a lot of Japanese manufacturers have moved their facilities to China, to Malaysia, to the Philippines, and that's further reducing rural and suburban employment opportunities. As a result, property in the countryside is dirt cheap, and it's probably going to stay that way until Japan grasps the nettle and starts the process of land reform so that the small farms can get consolidated and you can get more industrial farming going on there. Young, ambitious people continue to move from the countryside to the city, and the destination of choice remains Tokyo. It's the center of government, business, education, media, and transportation. And seniors are also moving to Tokyo to retire because the quality of life there is good, and also medical care, if you're older, is better in Tokyo. So if you're going to invest in Japan, I would stick personally to Tokyo's 23 wards, particularly the 3 core wards, Minato-ku, Chiyoda-ku, and Chuo-ku. Despite Japan's shrinking population, the number of people actually living in Tokyo increased by 67,000 in 2012. Tokyo's population is actually expected to peak in 2020, and that will ensure a steady stream of people renting from you, while the rest of the country generally depopulates. If you're buying for your own use, you could also consider Yokohama, which is nearby, has got very good quality of life, and has also got a history of hosting foreign residents, several hundred years worth. Second, if you're going to buy, target small apartments ranging in size from about 10 to about 30 square meters. Apartments in mass market buildings are best, located near key train and subway lines. They're easiest to rent. Proximity to public transit is really, really important because just about everybody takes trains and subways in Japan. Some lines are more popular than others, and prices actually drop the further that you move away from train and subway stations. Plain apartment blocks are easier for agents to rent, and they appeal to local working people. Luxury apartments for foreigners, on the other hand, have been a bad investment, particularly because unlike Hong Kong, where the foreign and the expat, or the local and the expat markets intermingle, in Japan, local people aren't really interested in granite countertops and gourmet kitchens. That's really not part of their desires. And since Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, the number of high-paid expats in Japan has decreased, so landlords have actually had to cut rents to retain good tenants. Third, you're going to want to look for older buildings. Japanese buyers prefer new buildings when they buy, but new homes in Japan depreciate very, very quickly. And tenants, on the other hand, don't mind living in an older, well-maintained building. Ask the agent to check that the building's repair history to make sure that all of the necessary work has been done and to see if anything has been deferred. The agent can also check the building to see that the repair fund has got sufficient funds in there to pay for any major renovations that are expected, and also that all of your other neighbors are paying. You don't want to be the only person who's paying the maintenance fees. Some buildings have undergone an asbestos survey or a seismic evaluation, but that's not universal, and if it has happened, you can actually ask for that in the explanation of important matters, and they'll tell you. By the way, if you buy an apartment with a tenant, you won't actually be able to see the inside of it before you sign off on it. You have to buy that on faith. Fourth, as I mentioned, the value is actually in the land, not in the building. So you want to make sure that the apartment is on owned and not leased land. Avoid reclaimed land because that can liquefy if there's a major earthquake. And apartments built by well-known developers like this Lyons Mansion apartment here are very desirable. If you can buy in an area that's slated for redevelopment, like for example in around Midtown in Tokyo's Roppongi area, that's obviously a good bet as well. Fifth, you're going to want to find a competent agent and a competent property manager. If you don't speak Japanese, if you live somewhere else, you're going to be relying on them to help you with rentals, with paperwork, and so much more. So you're going to want somebody who you can communicate with, who you trust, and who cares about your investment and cares about you. Now let's look at the actual process of buying a flat in Tokyo. Given the financing difficulties that I mentioned a minute ago, there's a very good chance that you're actually going to pay cash when you buy. When you find a place that you like, the agent will make an offer on your behalf, and then you'll pay the agent earnest money or a deposit, and then he'll read you the explanation of important matters. A sale and purchase agreement will then be executed, and then you'll pay the balance of the purchase price. So here's a rundown of some of the fees that you'll be looking at. You pay the agent commission equal to 3% of the purchase price plus 63,000 yen. And agents often work for both the buyer and the seller. Sometimes in down markets you can negotiate discounts. Right now that would be hard to do. If you buy a new home from a developer, you don't pay commissions. You'll also pay a specialist lawyer called a judicial scrivener about 100,000 to 150,000 yen to handle the conveyancing and also the title registration. And buildings and land are actually registered separately because they're separate legal entities in Japan. And don't forget about taxes. You'll pay 5% consumption tax on buildings bought from a company and on agents' fees. There is no consumption tax though on land. On April 1, 2014, the consumption tax is going to go from 5% to 8%, so you might want to time your purchase before that. And you'll also pay a stamp tax, acquisition tax on the land and building, and an annual possession tax. If you're renting out, you're going to need a property manager, and you'll be liable for income taxes. And when you cash out, if you're so fortunate as to earn a profit, you'll be liable for capital gains tax. The capital gains tax goes down if you hold the property for more than 5 years. So now I'm going to wrap up with a case study and sort of show you how all of the pieces fit together. In November 2010, I bought a 21 square meter apartment in Itabashi-ku that was built in 1974. The unit is in a 7-story steel reinforced concrete building. And as you can see from the foreground there, that's the Shuto Expressway, one of the major arterials that circles downtown Tokyo. The apartment came with a tenant who is a retired civil servant, and he continues to live there 3 years on. It took me about 6 weeks from making an offer to actually closing on the deal. So here's some numbers from that purchase. The actual purchase price was 4.2 million yen, which I paid in cash. And after all the taxes and fees and bits and pieces, it came to just a little bit more than 4.8 million yen. At the exchange rate of the day, that worked out to about 58,000 US dollars. Taxes and fees made up about 13% of the purchase price, which, if you've done the numbers on similar deals, you probably think is actually a bit high. But that was offset by the rental yield. And here's a breakdown of how that worked out. The tenant actually pays a rent of 53,000 yen a month. And out of that, the landlord actually pays the maintenance and repair fees as well as the management fees. After all taxes and expenses, the yield actually, though, is over 10%. which is not hard to argue with. And as I said, the beauty of this is that it doesn't correlate with Hong Kong, it doesn't correlate with Singapore, it doesn't correlate with China. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, but now I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.